today I'm going to be refuting Andrea Carvajal's speech. Her proposition was that an extensive use of body cameras would benefit law enforcement. She had three secondary claims. Her first one being that body cameras keep track of evidence at the scene. Her second being that it surveys the actions of the officers. And the third being that cameras would enhance the trust of the people. So the first two propositions are underdeveloped because they provide no supporting evidence. There is no evidence that the source is reliable, and it shows that she literally just said that information on she just provided information on body cameras and said that the change in attitude when police officers wear them, and it didn't really clarify if it was a change in the officers or in the people that were being detained, and there was no research or anything like that provided that backed up that claim. And it also contradicts your third secondary claim, which is that cameras would enhance the trust of the people, but why would there be false accusations made if evidence is there for the judge to see? So the cameras are costly and are easily damaged. Going back to your first one, you said that it keeps track of the scene, but body cameras are costly and are easily damaged. They would violate not only the privacy of the police officer, but also the public's. For example, if a police officer enters one's home, everything would be recorded, and if involved with the physical fight, the camera is pretty much useless because everything's going to be kind of blocked. And it would mostly serve as recording audio, which is most of the time already recorded from the dispatcher that's on the phone when they call for backup. And for your secondary claim, instead of providing evidence, you ask the question of, do oppressors feel intimidated when seeing the camera, which in many cases now in time isn't always the person being arrested, being convicted, but the police officer using excessive force. I found in an article in the New York Times, a study that was made in October 2017, that for 18 months, more than 2,000 police officers in Washington equipped with cameras used force and prompted civilian complaints at about the same rate as those who did not have them, which just goes to show that even if they do have them, they still acted pretty much the same way. And for your third claim, which was that cameras would enhance the trust of the public, I was watching a court case of Terrence Crutcher, who his car broke down on the side of the road, and Officer Betty Jo Shelby approached him, and he said that Terrence was acting suspicious and not following his orders, and he immediately proceeded to shoot him, and as another officer was tasing him, and he was charged with first-degree manslaughter after the shooting and was labeled homicide, and on May 17, 2017, he was found not guilty, which just goes to show that even if there is surveillance cameras on the police officers, they still get away with murder. And I was watching an interview on GQ of Officer Davis, who was a former cop, and they asked him if he thought that body cameras would make a difference, and he said, I don't think there's anything you can add to an officer's duty belt that would change the situation. It helps that there's more video, but it's in the control of the law enforcement, and we've seen it if it benefits them, then they release it, which has been in many cases where people are in trial and they don't release any footage. And in conclusion, using her first secondary claim, which cameras keep track of the evidence at the scene, and the second one being that surveys the action of the officers, and the third one that cameras would enhance the trust of the people, I hope that you guys realize that her claims are false.
Okay, the structural stuff is previewed pretty well. You basically kind of group the first 2 points and suggest that there's a lack of evidence on those individual points that the advocate presented, that there's no source, there's no examples that are being used to support those particular points. And your explanation about how it contradicts the third point needs to be explained a little bit more clearly. You never come back to that particular point when we get to the third point, so that premise that you're presenting there seems like it's just sitting there, and I'm not sure it accomplishes what you want it to gain you. On the first point, you kind of have a counterclaim about it being costly and damaging, but there's really not any evidence on those particular points. You do mention the potential of privacy being violated and that people's homes could theoretically be invaded by these sorts of things, and I think there might be a concern about that. The question becomes, does that undermine the evidence, or is the evidence not change in regard to any of this? I think you did suggest hypothetically that, look, if a fight breaks out or if there's an issue where the police officer has to become physical involved in the process, that you generally don't get clear video anyway. I think that's a valid point, and I do think that you need to have some information on that. You sort of suggest on the third point, when you mention cases where police officers have been prosecuted where they haven't been able to get a conviction, I don't know if that was because of a lack of clarity in the evidence that was being presented, or if there is a dispute over how to interpret the events that are being seen there. If you could show, for instance, that the video evidence was not useful in any of those situations, that would be helpful. You kind of just make the assumption that the video evidence was not useful in those situations. I think that's a little bit problematic. The best piece of evidence that you have in your argument is the study in Washington. I wasn't clear if it was Washington, D.C. or Washington State, where there was a comparison between police officers who had the body cameras and those who didn't. And there's a general reference to a statistic that says that there doesn't seem to be any difference in the amount of use of force or in the change in the number of complaints that police officers get against them. I think that that's a very important piece of information because it undermines the premise that there is going to be some difference because of these cameras. The third point, you kind of basically go on the one example suggesting, look, we had this situation that happened, the police officer shot the person, they weren't convicted despite the fact that we had some of this on video. I think there's a more general argument to be made that says that the video information is not necessarily going to get the outcome that some people want from this situation. And here's an example about how we didn't get that. Court cases and criminal actions are always complicated. It includes a variety of things, and the video evidence would be one part of that process, but it's not the complete part of the process. And I think putting it into context would make that argument a little bit more useful. It sounded like you had a quote from a police officer in the GQ that talked about how officers' actions were not going to change, but as you were presenting that quote, it seemed like you mumbled off a little bit as to what it was actually saying, and I'm not exactly sure that the conclusion of the source that you're citing there is the same as you were presenting in that particular situation. And then there's also an argument about footage not being released, which was not very clear, so it felt a little bit like you kind of wandered off of the reservation there at the end and were making arguments that were less clear. Presentation-wise, there's a lot of reading that goes on. I'm not sure you ever looked up at us once, and that I think is a little bit problematic for your ethos. All right, thank you. Do you have an outline? Thank you.